Hello everyone and welcome to my YouTube channel. My name is Dr. Wild. In this channel, I'm going to majorly focus on discussing wildlife conservation and management. The main reason why I created this channel is to try and reach as many people as possible, just to enlighten them about the values and the importance of conserving and maintaining wildlife. So from this presentation, we're going to start from introduction to wildlife conservation and management, and this we're going to discuss under very different subtopics. Number one, we're going to understand what is wildlife, then what is wildlife conservation, what is wildlife management, the history of wildlife conservation and management, why wildlife conservation and management, challenges facing wildlife conservation and management, then the emerging issues in wildlife conservation and management, and lastly, under the introductory part, we're going to discuss wildlife utilization. What is wildlife? Wildlife simply refers to the animals that are not domesticated and plants that are not horticulturally cultivated. Usually what comes into mind when we mention wildlife are the lions, the elephants, the hippos, and the cheetahs. That is what a majority of people understand when we talk of wildlife. But this is a very broad topic. It encompasses both animals in their natural habitats and plants that are not horticulturally cultivated. In other words, we can say these are organisms that occur and thrive in natural habitats without man's intervention. What is wildlife conservation? Wildlife conservation is a social process that integrates traditional and professional activities and knowledge that aim towards wise use of wild fauna and flora, thus maintaining the productivity of wildlife habitats. The main goal here is wise use and maintaining the productivity of wildlife so that the future and the present will continue to enjoy their benefits. We have activities like regulated hunting, cropping, and reforestation, to mention a few. And on to the next one. What is wildlife management? Wildlife management is the art and science of changing the characteristics and interactions of habitats, wild populations, and man. Art simply means the continuous creative processes that we engage in and modify through build-up of knowledge to try and preserve, increase, or decrease wild populations to suit the environment. We don't want them to exceed carrying capacity of the environment. We still want man to enjoy the benefits that come from the environment, but we want to do it in a way that preserves, increases, or decreases depending on the state of wildlife around that zone at the moment. And by doing this, managers follow given principles that guide them in coming up with management objectives and reaching management decisions. From there we move to what is the history of wildlife conservation and management. As we well aware, the history of wildlife management goes way back to creation. But when we try to track fast, in the late 13th century, wildlife management was established mainly to benefit the upper class in Europe. And in 1536, Henry VIII established the protection for all waterfalls during the period of May and August. So during this period, James I also extended landowners' protection of trespass to all hunting for game protection. So to understand best the history of wildlife conservation, we're going to break them down into eras. So the first era is the era of abundance, which was during the 1600 to 1849. So during this period, wildlife was considered unlimited resource. The only concern then was on predator control. Like, for example, paying 1 penny for wolf killed in mass. This was done in Bay Colony in 1630, I mean. So in 1646, establishment of deer hunting season. In 1779, the Act of Preservation of Deer was passed in Vermont. In 1848, in Rhode Island, the Rhode Island passed a law against hunting migratory game birds in spring. On to the second era, the era of exploitation, which happened during the period of 1850 to 1899. And the main purpose here was to control the harvest of wildlife. And this is the era that again was marked as the bad era for the buffaloes. It is during this period that about 8.5 million buffaloes were shot between 1871 and 1872. And one famous guy known as Buffalo Bill Cody, this guy was famous for shooting about 200 buffaloes daily. And during this time, the first state game laws and salaried game wardens were established. In 1864, the New York implemented the first state hunting license. Yellowstone became established as the final park in 1872. The limits on game birds was established in Iowa. During this period, by 1880, all states had game laws. Until the third era, known as the era of protection, which occurred between 1900 to 1929. During this period, in 1900, I mean, Lacey Act was put in place to regulate the importation of exotic wildlife. Interstate transportation of illegally killed wildlife were made federal offense. By 1913, the Weeks-McLean Act was also put in place, which gave federal control over migratory birds. It also ended hunting of spring waterfowl. And by 1915, the Funds for Predator Control section was established, which also saw the establishment of state game and fish departments. On to the fourth era, known as the era of game management, between 1930 and 1965. During this period, the public funding increased and conservation administration was made effective. And by 1934, the Dark Stamp Act, which saw the money collected from the stamps were to be used in wetlands protection, for breeding, migration, stopovers, and wintering for waterfalls. So all the funds that were collected from this dark stamp were channeled towards wetlands protection. Again, during this period, during this year 1934, the Peterman-Robertson Act was established, and this act taxed all the hunting equipment were taxed during that period. So in a way, it controlled hunting. Onto the fifth era, known as the era of environmental management, between 1966 to present, ongoing. In 1966, Endangered Species Act was established. 1969 National Environmental Policy Act was put in place. 1976, environmental policy agencies was put in place. 1980, Non-Game Wildlife Act was put in place. By 1999, endangered wildlife species list that included 133 mammals, 124 birds, and 25 fish was established. It is during this period that wildlife conservation and environmental management became rampant, and people have since then started developing a positive attitude towards wildlife conservation and management, and it is still ongoing. It's an ongoing process that we hope will continue to the point where people fully understand and appreciate the values of this wildlife. Why do you need to conserve wildlife conservation? Why do you need to conserve wildlife? The main aim or the main purpose of wildlife conservation and management is to ensure that the availability of wildlife for the present and future generations to enjoy and appreciate. We don't want to overutilize these resources to their detriment. We need our children's children, the future generation, to also appreciate and enjoy the benefits that come from these natural resources. Wildlife presents an array of benefits ranging and not limited to aesthetics, that is the beauty, recreational activities, we go diving, hiking, scuba diving, snorkeling, mention them. Scientific value, research and education. There are a lot of research going on wildlife education. Wildlife clubs, they are doing a lot of research and education. Economic value, we trade wildlife but on permission. The fishes, the timber. Back then in Kenya, we used to, during the Moi period, cut one tree, plant four. You'd cut down your trees, but it was mandated by law. As you do that, you go and sell your timber. You also plant more to replenish the ones that you've harvested. Ecological value, food security. Now that we understand why we should conserve these precious resources, there are also challenges that come with this. Number one is poaching, urbanization. As the towns expand, as the cities expand, we encroach into these animals' natural habitats, putting them on the verge of collapse. Wildfires, for example, what happened last year in Australia, that saw almost 1 billion wildlife killed. Deforestation, because of the expanding human population, the need for timber. This one is destroying the wildlife habitats, is increasing human population. Climate change, industrialization, the emission of carbon gases, depletion of ozone layer. There are myths about wildlife conservation. Where I come from, there are myths about the owl, so that when you see the owl bird, it's associated with some bad omens to come. So people will try as much as possible to kill these birds. Of exploitation, pests and diseases, there are still people are still researching on them to find ways of how to control these diseases and pests. Loss of habitat due to deforestation, urbanization, wildfires, increasing human population, and forth. There are also emerging issues on wildlife conservation and management, and one major one being technology. The emerging issues can either be positive or negative depending on the impact. Technology is one of them. Today we can easily track the movements of wildlife so that we are always aware where they are. A special team like the game wardens and the rangers can be sent to protect them against the poachers. So people like in Masai, in Samburu, where they use mixed telematic system to track these wild animals, it's making the control of poachers very effective, as well as in Lewa it's happening, Lewa Wildlife Conservancy. Another emerging issue is the failure of conservation to compete effectively as an alternative form of land use. People still don't appreciate these natural resources as a form of land use because the communities around these conservancies, they don't feel the benefits of conserving wildlife, and therefore they would want to encroach as much as possible into these wildlife habitats to do either agriculture or plant their crops, something like that. So when we realize that wildlife can bring more benefits or equal benefits to what agriculture is doing, then we will be able to overcome these issues. Land ownership. Currently, people are going into private type of land ownership. The community lands are fast. The community land system is fast diminishing. This means the space for wildlife, the corridors are being encroached into. People are moving, people are fencing their plots. This is going to bring a bigger challenge. Government policies. In a government where wildlife conservation acts are not properly implemented, there's a lot of war between man and wildlife. So these policies, when harmonized correctly and right, will be able to overcome these challenges. Habitat degradation from climate change, urbanization, human population increasing, blockage of wildlife corridors through fencing, through private land ownerships, of exploitation, so that one man takes all. We go hunting, we take as many as thousands and hundreds of buffaloes, which happened during the era of exploitation. We saw almost 8.5 million buffaloes killed between 1871 and 1872. Human population growing, human wildlife conflict, which is very common around Kajiado area. Man and lion, there's a very big conflict. Lions eating the domestic animals, the cows, the goats. Man retaliating by killing these wildlife. Poverty, kitchen gardening and hydroponics. As the technology develops, people tend to do their small agricultures in their compounds. People use hydroponic methods, which is very effective. So instead of going to encroach into the wildlife habitat, technology has made it possible to get the same crops in a very small piece of land in your compound. There was also the quail and ostrich fantasy. I call it the mental conmanship. So that some people argued that the quail egg or the ostrich egg was a cure for cancer. This saw ostrich egg and the quails being hunted everywhere. So this one in a way affects the population of these animals. The diseases, for example, the chronic wasting disease, the diseases from deep freeze that are coming as thawing is going on, they start to manifest. And these diseases, we don't have much knowledge about them. The coronavirus currently, as it goes on, the funds for wildlife diminishes because there are no tourists coming in to fund the activities of conservation. Finally, on introduction to wildlife conservation and management, we're looking at wildlife utilization. And these are categorized into two major groups. Number one, consumptive wildlife, utilization of wildlife. This is the use of wildlife that involves literal killing of wildlife through hunting, fishing, and trapping of wildlife as a source of food, medicine, hide and skin, sports hunting, etc. So this is the use of wildlife that is mostly discouraged. Number 2, we have non-consumptive wildlife utilization. This is the use of wildlife as a source of enjoyment and appreciation for nature. For example, the aesthetics beauty of the wildlife through photography. We go on picnics with our loved ones, we do zip lining, we go swimming, we do bird watching, hiking, snorkeling, surfing, board racing, research. No killing is involved. So with this introduction, I believe we are equipped to delve further into the importance and wildlife conservation as a cause. Please, thank you for having time to listen to my presentation, and I further endeavor to give more details on wildlife conservation and management. Please remember to hit the like and subscribe button to enjoy more presentations that will come in future. Please also remember to leave your comments in the section below. As many questions as you wish, I will try as much as possible to respond to all. We'll have a good discussion as we move forward. Yes.